On, there we go. Am I on? There we go. All right, I'm sorry. Good morning. Welcome to the Austin chapter of Reasons to Believe. Let me open us with a short prayer this morning. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you so much for this weekend where we can take some time off and we can relax and rest and power up in your word and to learn more about you and learn about this subject of miracles. Please be with us as we digest this, that we can listen and we can learn, and even for myself to please give me the words to say so that I can convey the message clearly and that your will is done and served overall. Please help us as we go out and we begin to talk to our friends and neighbors and coworkers, that we can be that light, be that beacon unto you. These things we ask in Jesus' name. Amen. So thank you very much for joining us today. And so I want to go through a few announcements real quick before we move into the presentation. So just a reminder that last month, Dr. Hugh Ross joined us via Zoom, and he gave a presentation in regard to his book titled Weathering Climate Change. It was a really great presentation. We've had a lot of hits on that in the last month. And so if you missed that, I would encourage you to go back and see it. It is still up and available on our YouTube channel. And so past meetings, past videos are still on our YouTube channel. And so for the first time, people are starting to ask again with hope, when are we going to return to our live in-person meetings? And so just to give you an update in that regard, in January, I reached out to the LFC, the Longhorn for Christ building, where we normally meet, and tried to see if we could reschedule the venue beginning in September. And so we have been able to reschedule that beginning in September. At the time, they were thinking that we would have enough vaccines for everybody by July, and that the month of August would maybe give us a little bit of period, and so hopefully by mid-September we could get going. It's now looking like we might have enough vaccines for all adults by the end of May, and by every single American by July. So we're going to play it by ear moving forward, but at this point, the plan is we're going to go back to live in-person meetings begin in September. They will not be held on YouTube Live because we simply don't have the equipment and the personnel and the technology at the LFC. However, we do still plan to record those, and in the future, probably a few weeks or a month after the live presentation, we may go ahead with the speaker's permission put those on our YouTube channel so that they would be widely available. So keep that in mind. We'll talk about it more in the coming meetings. So just a couple of other promotional announcements. So next month, very, very excited to have Dr. John Franklin Lane come and speak. And this has been a really challenging presentation to promote because Lacey and I heard him, and we had no idea that he was going to be speaking. He spoke at our church, and so when he stepped up to the microphone, had no idea what to expect, and then were just blown away by the story that unfolded. And so I sort of want everyone to be able to enjoy that same experience that we had, not knowing anything about what he was going to talk about. But it's hard to promote that and get people interested in it, just sort of a trust me. So what I'll tell you is that this is going to be a story that you will never forget. And it's a little bit outside of the normal RTB wheelhouse. So normally we get involved in strong scientific evidence on behalf of the faith, and we marshal philosophical arguments on behalf of the faith. This is going to be a little bit different. This is going to involve the personal testimony of a person. And so, again, I'm very excited. When we heard it, we only heard an abbreviated version of this story. He had to cut it down to about 25 minutes. He said that his normal presentation is about 45 or 50 minutes. So Lacey and I are definitely looking forward to hearing the rest of the story, as Paul Harvey used to say. So mark your calendars for Saturday, April the 10th, for Dr. John Franklin Lane. And then in May, we're, again, very blessed, very fortunate to have Dr. Walter Bradley be a member of our chapter and agree to speak to us on an annual basis. And he's going to come back and he's going to look at what happens when we die and offer a scientific perspective. So his is always one of the best presentations we get each year. So again, I would encourage you to circle your calendar for May. Now, we will have a live Q&A after the presentation today, so please make a note of the email address, which is reasonstbaustin. TB stands for to believe, so reasonstbaustin@yahoo.com. We do have people here who will be fielding those questions and hopefully reading those at the end of this presentation. If you think of a question while we're moving forward with the presentation, feel free to go ahead and send it in, and that way we have a list of questions ready to go at the end of the presentation. And then I will remind you that today's presentation is part 2 of the series on prayer and miracles, and that part 1 of the series was delivered in January. It was titled, Does Prayer Work? And again, it's available on our YouTube channel. So if you missed that and you're watching this presentation, then please go back and watch part 1 when you have the time and at your convenience. So, I always put together notes for my presentation, and I mentioned in January that I would have notes for both part 1 and part 2, and so I have hard copy notes, and I have these available, and so this contains the notes for both part 1 and part 2, and if you would like a hard copy, then again, send in an email at reasonstbaustin@yahoo.com. And I'll let you know how we can get these to you. I also have these in the PDF, so if you just want to receive an email and receive them digitally, then I can send you both part 1 and part 2 in a PDF. And so again, if you enjoy this, the notes are everything that you'll hear in this presentation, and then I have an appendix, which usually is even longer than the presentation, that has a lot of the supporting research and evidence, and it's all documented and footnoted. That way you can go and find it yourself if you want to investigate these things further. I was joking with my wife Lacey this week that I went back and reread the appendix for this presentation, and I told her, I said, there's some really good stuff in there that I had to cut out. So again, I would encourage you to reach out and get those notes if you're interested. So, part 2 of prayer and miracles, is it rational to believe in miracles? So in discussing a subject like this, I think it's very important to be very clear about the type of miracles that we're discussing when we're referring to miracles. So David Hume was a Scottish philosopher during the Enlightenment period in the 18th century. He was very influential during the Enlightenment period, and he wrote an essay that was titled Of Miracles. Now, this was first published in 1748, and it is the most widely reprinted literature on the topic of miracles of all time. One can hardly read anything on the subject of miracles without Hume being referenced or addressed or quoted in some fashion. And his thoughts have been widely influential and parroted by many skeptics and atheists, while at the same time being summarily criticized by many theists and other philosophers, including other atheists and skeptical philosophers. So in his essay, he provides the following definition of a miracle. He notes, a miracle is a violation of the laws of nature. However, in the endnotes of his presentation, he then elaborates further on this definition, noting, a miracle may be accurately defined a transgression of a law of nature by a particular volition of the deity or by the interposition of some invisible agent. So in the first sense, a miracle is simply a supernatural event, something that defies or happens outside of the laws of nature. In the second sense, he adds that this was something that was caused by a deity or an invisible agent. Now, theists, on the other hand, tend to put miracles into 3 broad categories, and the titles of these categories will differ depending upon who's describing them, but the definition of the categories are pretty similar across the board. And since this is a Reasons to Believe chapter meeting, I'm going to use the titles that Dr. Ross uses when he describes miracles. So the first category of miracle is what's called sustaining miracles. So direct credit is given to God for the very orderly nature, the just right state of things, the exquisitely fine-tuned nature of the universe. We see this as we continue to discover the delicately balanced conditions that are required to sustain and support human life. When someone refers to the miracle of birth, it's God's sustaining miracle or providence that is being acknowledged and recognized. Nothing, quote, supernatural is involved, but God is given credit for the awesome wonder of the natural. The second category of miracles are transformation miracles. These are when God acts throughout history using naturally occurring events in order to accomplish His will. So God can arrange natural happenings and or the free acts of persons to accomplish His purpose. So for example, in the book of Acts, when the Apostle Paul and Silas were in a Roman prison, a violent earthquake caused the prison doors to open and their chains to come loose. So this literally opened the door for Paul and Silas to witness to their jailer and be released from prison. Now, no laws of nature were necessarily broken. Instead, this natural event involving an earthquake was used by God for a particular purpose. Now, some people often coin the term constellation miracles to refer to a series of events that seem to come together in order to produce a divine outcome. So Dr. Scott Kolbaba is a medical physician, and he put together a book which was a compilation of stories that other doctors told him about miracles that they had personally witnessed or experienced. At the end of his book, he summarizes, noting, many of the stories in this book have contained what I call divine coincidences, events and people inexplicably coming together with amazing results. Only in retrospect were they able to recognize the connections. Now, one advantage of growing older is my ability to look back and recognize an unseen hand directing my path. What many might call coincidence, I deem providence. The constellation miracle is another form of transformation miracle. And this is a series of events that come together to produce a divine outcome. Again, nothing strictly supernatural may have happened, but God's divine hand appears to be unmistakable to some. So for the theist, sustaining and transformation miracles are very widely and rightly seen as confirmation of God's existence. However, these likely would not be very compelling to the skeptic or the atheist. No, for them, the transcendent miracles, the miracle that's described by Hume, the miracles that violate the laws of the nature would be the only type of miracle that would be worthy of the name. So, in considering the possibility of miracles, it's very important for a rational person to at least be open to the evidence. One of the many criticisms of Hume's essay is that he defines a miracle in such a way that no amount of eyewitness testimony, no amount of credible evidence would ever be sufficient enough to establish the veracity of a miracle. And so for some, it doesn't matter how solid the argument or how strong the evidence, that if it requires appealing to the supernatural, they won't even entertain or consider the possibility. C.S. Lewis has noted, whatever experiences we may have, we shall not regard them as miraculous if we already hold a philosophy which excludes the supernatural. We can always say that we have been victims of an illusion. And if we disbelieve in the supernatural, this is what we always shall say. And remember that later. We'll be returning to that thought, that comment, in just a moment. Experience proves this or that or nothing according to the preconceptions we bring to it. So, John, it appears that we're having some technical difficulties. Are we even live online? We are, okay. Okay, so I'll go ahead and continue, and then if you're having any difficulties with the slides, I'll catch up with them here in a moment. So my goal in this presentation is to appeal to the atheist or the skeptic. So I'm not going to appeal to sustaining or transformation miracles in an effort to make my case. Now, I have read a lot of books and articles on the subject of miracles in preparation for this, and one of those was a book by Eric Metaxas that was titled Miracles. And in this book, he details the stories, chapter after chapter after chapter, of many miracle stories, and he says that he limited these stories to people that he personally knew so that he could have confidence in the veracity of these stories and the integrity of them. Unfortunately, I don't think that many atheists or skeptics will find this book to be very compelling. Now listen, I hope that every single one of these stories, which are all fascinating, are true. But all of them are just simply told by word of mouth. None of them have any supporting documents or anything other than requiring the reader to simply take their word for it. And so again, these types of stories, I think many atheists and skeptics will be found wanting. No, my intention is to appeal to transcendent miracles. These are the miracles described by Hume. These are the ones that violate and require an explanation that exists outside of the laws of nature. And if we can establish that there is compelling evidence on behalf of transcendent miracles, then perhaps we can be more open to the concept that the God of the Bible is perhaps responsible for some or all of them. So today I'm going to be looking at what I consider to be five compelling lines of evidence on behalf of supernatural transformation miracles. And I'm going to begin with the one that I think is the best documented and probably the one that is probably the closest thing to a scientific proof of the supernatural that there can possibly be. And that is the Big Bang creation of the universe. So Jim Holt is a science writer, and he talks about the prevailing thought, the prevailing understanding before Big Bang theory came along. He notes, the ancient Greeks were the pioneers of rational cosmogony, yet the Greeks never raised the question of why there is a world rather than nothing at all. Their cosmogonies always involved some sort of starting material. It was simply assumed to be eternal. Later, it was generally conceded that the question of why the world exists was beyond the reach of science. So the existence of the world could only be a brute fact. Bertrand Russell summed up the philosophical consensus, quote, I should say that the universe is just there, and that is all. Science, for the most part, concurred. The brute fact take on existence is a fairly comfortable one if you assume that the universe has always been around. Einstein, in theorizing, simply assumed the eternity of the universe, and he fudged his relativity equations accordingly. With the discovery of the Big Bang, however, everything changed. So what is the Big Bang? Dr. Joanne Baker gives us a very succinct definition. The Big Bang, the birth of the universe in a phenomenal explosion, created all space, matter, and time as we know it. Predicted from the mathematics of general relativity, we see evidence for the Big Bang in the rush of galaxies away from our own, the quantities of light elements in the universe, and the microwave glow that fills the sky. So Jim Holt elaborates further on the logical consequences of Big Bang theory, noting, but both theory and empirical evidence pointed to the same verdict. The universe must have had an abrupt beginning in time. Now, if there is a cause for this event, it must transcend space-time, hence the title Transcendent Miracle, and hence escape the reach of science. The conceptual breakdown of science at the Big Bang was disturbing to cosmologists, but they proceeded to prove with mathematical certainty that there must have been a singularity at the beginning of the universe. Dr. Robert Jastrow is an American astronomer, and he's also a planetary physicist, and he wrote a book that is a really excellent layman's book detailing the history of Big Bang theory and its eventual confirmation. And in his book, he notes, in my case, it should be understood from the start that I'm agnostic in religious matters. However, I am fascinated by the implications in some of the scientific developments of recent years. And the essence of these developments is that the universe had, in some sense, a beginning. That it began at a certain moment in time and under circumstances that seemed to make it impossible, not just now, but ever, to find out what force or forces brought the world into beginning at that moment. Scientists cannot bear the thought of a natural phenomenon which cannot be explained even with unlimited time and money. There is a kind of religion in science, and it is the religion of a person who believes that there is order and harmony in the universe. Every event can be explained in a rational way as the product of some previous event. Every effect must have its cause. There is no first cause like God. The religious faith of the scientist is violated by the discovery that the world had a beginning under conditions in which the known laws of physics are not valid and is a product of forces or circumstances we cannot discover. A sound explanation may exist for the explosive birth of our universe, but if it does, science cannot find out what that explanation is. This is an exceedingly strange development, unexpected by all but the theologians. As Jastrow confirms, the Big Bang is beyond the reach of science, is another way of saying that it is a supernatural event. It transcends the laws of science. The laws of nature will be incapable of explaining it, or they will be invalid, as Jastrow put it. Now, the reason why the laws of nature will be incapable or invalid is because they came into existence at the same time as the universe did. So in the same way that you can't appeal to yourself to explain your own birth or your own beginning, you can't appeal to the laws of nature to explain their beginning. These laws of physics can't tell you what happened before they began to exist. So because of that, the Big Bang creation of the universe would be a supernatural event, meaning that it requires a cause that exists outside of, over and above, or beyond this universe and its laws of nature. Now, could there be a natural explanation for the Big Bang? Well, there are some scientists who continue to try and get around the implications of a singularity. They try to appeal to novel theories in order to eliminate this singularity, to eliminate the creation or the beginning of the universe. Now, I don't have time to get into all of these various theories and what is proposed, but I can say that Dr. Michael Strauss, who is a particle physicist, has noted that anyone today who's continuing to try and get around the Big Bang creation of the universe is probably guilty of having a blind faith in some sort of an unknown or unproven form of physics. And he says they're probably more guilty of wishful thinking than they are good theoretical science. The science writer Ben Dupree confirms, among today's scientists, the Big Bang cosmology is the most widely accepted view of the origin and evolution of the universe. The idea of an initial singularity, as the Big Bang is more formally called, follows with apparent inevitability from Einstein's general theory of relativity. The Big Bang, having so far rebuffed all major challengers, remains the cornerstone of modern cosmology. As noted, the Big Bang is a product of Einstein's general theory of relativity, and a team led by the Nobel Prize winner Joseph Taylor has been able to confirm the accuracy of general relativity to a trillionth percentage point. That's 14 decimal places. The great mathematician Roger Penrose has stated that general relativity is probably the most accurately tested theory currently known to science. Now, in his book, Jastrow also quotes Alan Sandage. Alan Sandage is an astronomer and considered by many, recognized by many, to be the father of modern astronomy. Well, in his book, Sandage states, "It is such a strange conclusion. It cannot really be true." Now, at the time, Sandage was an atheist, but his work in astronomy would eventually lead him to become a theist and eventually a Christian. And at an Origins conference in 1985, Sandage would say this in regard to the Big Bang: "Here is evidence for what can only be described as a supernatural event. There is no way that this could have been predicted within the realm of physics as we know it. Whatever cause brought the universe into existence, whether it's mechanistic or personal, this cause would be supernatural, meaning that it would exist outside of, over and above, or beyond this universe and its laws of nature." The second line of evidence. Do you believe that you have the ability to think, act, and reason freely? Or do you believe that the laws of nature, along with your internal genetic chemistry and your formulative social background, collectively determine everything that you think and do, ultimately beyond your control? Now, if you think that you do have the ability, or if you believe that you have the ability to think, act, and reason freely, then you already hold a supernatural view of the world. You already embrace and acknowledge the supernatural. The Center for Supernaturalism, or the Center for Naturalism, confirms. Naturalism is simply the understanding that there exists a single natural physical world or universe in which we are completely included. There are not two different worlds, the supernatural and natural. Naturalism says that we are completely physical, material creatures produced by evolution. So we don't possess immaterial souls or spirits or any mental stuff inside us that's separate from our physical being. We are the products of our social and family environment and the genetics given us at birth. We are not, quote, causally privileged over the rest of nature. That is, we don't get to cause without being fully caused ourselves. To think that would be to hold a supernatural view of ourselves, the opposite of naturalism. So to say that we are not causally privileged is another way of saying that we do not have free will. The atheist or the skeptic that is committed to the worldview of naturalism must admit that they lack the ability to think, act, or reason freely. If they don't, if they think that they do have that power, then again, they believe in a supernatural view of the world. Cornell University professor William Provine confirms, the world is organized strictly in accordance with mechanistic principles. Free will, as it is traditionally conceived, the freedom to make uncoerced and unpredictable choices among alternative possible courses of action, simply does not exist. There is no way that the evolutionary process as currently conceived can produce a being that is truly free to make choices. Now listen, certainly everyone agrees that we appear to have the ability to think, act, and reason freely. We all enjoy this experience of freedom, okay? But the atheist or the skeptic that's committed to the worldview of naturalism then has to say, yes, but that is an illusion. They have to state, we simply do not, and from a naturalistic perspective, cannot have the freedom that we think we have. Recall the C.S. Lewis quote earlier, who noted that those who already hold a worldview rejecting the supernatural will always say that they've been victims of an illusion, and that's exactly what is happening here. Now, earlier I noted that it is my intent to appeal to the atheist and the skeptic, and so to them, I want to point out that once you admit that you lack the ability to think, act, and reason freely, and that the laws of nature, along with your internal genetic chemistry and your formative social background, collectively determine everything it is that you think and do, then logically, you have just forfeited the right to have any of your beliefs, thoughts, or arguments taken seriously. Because from a naturalistic perspective, any belief that you form is held not necessarily because it makes sense, not necessarily because it's true, or not necessarily because it flows logically and rationally from other held beliefs, but is held because of a physically determined, law-governed material state of the brain. The internationally respected atheist philosopher Thomas Nagel confesses the logical consequences from a naturalistic perspective, noting, external and internal causes produce our beliefs. Now, we may subject these processes to scrutiny in an effort to avoid error, but our conclusions at this next level also result, in part, from influences we do not control directly. And the same will be true no matter how far we carry the investigation. Our beliefs are always, ultimately, due to factors outside our control. It looks as though if any of our beliefs are true, It is pure biological luck rather than knowledge. Nagel's point is that according to naturalism, whatever beliefs you hold to be true, well, you are determined to think they're true. Whatever evidence, arguments, or reason you find particularly compelling, well, you were determined to find compelling. Whatever conclusions you reach, they are conclusions that you are physically determined to reach by the law-governed material state of your brain. Another human with a different genetic chemistry and social background may very well be physically determined to reach a different conclusion. How can you or I or anyone know that they are biologically lucky enough to actually believe the truth? So here's the question for the atheist or the skeptic. Why should you, I, or anyone take anything that you believe or argue or propose seriously? And this is the problem. No matter how you answer that question, whatever defense you offer, whatever argument you propose, you have to admit from a naturalistic perspective, right or wrong, true or false, that you were physically determined to respond. Now, why should anyone find that to be compelling? Now, is there a natural explanation for free will? Is one possible? Well, there are people who are known as compatibilists. And the compatibilists accept and acknowledge that we live in a physically determined universe. Everything has been determined since the very beginning of the creation of the universe. However, the compatibilist thinks that we still have just enough free will, just enough to still be held responsible for our thoughts, our choices, and our actions. In this sense, they believe that determinism and free will are compatible. That's why they're called compatibilists. The problem with this is that the compatibilist version of free will is not the same thing as the libertarian freedom that we all think that we experience. They really are guilty of playing word games. And there are a lot of philosophers who will also point out that their type of freedom is still a stripped down, still determined, still ultimately out of your control, quote, freedom. Now, if that sounds nonsensical, again, there are a lot of philosophers that agree. The atheist Sam Harris, he doesn't mince words in his criticism of compatibilism. He notes in one of his books, according to the compatibilist, if a man wants to commit murder, and he does so because of this desire, then his actions attest to his freedom of will. I mean, he ultimately did what he wanted to do. But from both a moral and scientific perspective, this seems deliberately obtuse. People have many competing desires. Where's the freedom in being perfectly satisfied with your thoughts, intentions, and subsequent actions when they are the product of prior events that you had absolutely no hand in creating? Compatibilism amounts to nothing more than an assertion of the following creed: well, a puppet is free as long as he loves his strings. This is the trouble with compatibilism. It solves the problem of free will by ignoring it. Now, even when pressed, compatibilists will admit that we lack the sort of libertarian freedom that we all think that we have. So for the atheist or the skeptic, they're either forced to admit that everything that they think and do and believe is physically determined and ultimately out of their control, and forfeit the right to have those beliefs and thoughts taken seriously, or they have to embrace the supernatural, okay, the ability to reason. The ability to think, act, and reason freely is one of the most self-evidently obvious facts that we can witness and we can experience. I don't have a PhD in physics. I have to, for the most part, take their word for it. I don't have a PhD in biology. And again, for the most part, I have to take the word of more learned people. But when it comes to my freedom, my ability to think, act, make decisions, okay, if that is an illusion, then there may be nothing that I can have any confidence in whatsoever when it comes to my belief and my thoughts. You may have heard the phrase, it would be a miracle if so-and-so ever made a decision. Well, according to naturalism, it truly would be a miracle anytime anyone ever freely decided anything. Line of evidence number 3. The show Forensic Files is a long-running criminal investigation program that spotlights the multiple ways in which forensic science has been able to solve various crimes. And at one time, I wanted to be in law enforcement, so these types of shows just naturally appealed to me. Well, there was one episode in particular that's titled Seedy Intentions, which I have found really fascinating. It chronicles and details the tragic murder of 9-year-old Cynthia Allinger. And the following is a clip. It is a portion of the show which is pertinent to our case. So we'll watch this clip now.
Neighbors' prayers for the child's safe return went unanswered. Even the promise of a $5,000 reward didn't produce results.
Have you guys heard about the missing little girl? Her name's Cynthia, and she's 9 years old.
2 weeks passed. Then, police received a call from a member of Rhonda's church. She said she saw something in a dream.
She described it as having a vision, some sort of religious experience where she saw something in her mind.
The woman said she had a vision of a young girl lying in a field who was either asleep or dead. She even drew a map of where the body was. The spot was a half-mile from Cindy's home, an area volunteers had already searched.
They did a search basically on their hands and knees looking for evidence, and they didn't find her the first time.
But this time, they found Cindy Allinger's body. She was under a water heater and wrapped in some carpet. Police now faced an unusual situation. A mother who failed a polygraph test and a psychic who mysteriously knew the location of Cindy's body.
I thought this was so bizarre that they would have found the body this way.
So how do we explain this naturally? You have a psychic who is able to tell the investigators the location of the body and actually draw a map of where the body was, leading them to the body. Well, at this point in the episode, I'd say that actually there's a pretty good natural explanation. It would appear that the mother who has failed a polygraph test is probably guilty in regard to what happened to her daughter. As well, you have a psychic who happens to be a member of the mother's church, so perhaps she's an accomplice, or perhaps she just happened to overhear the mother talking about this and talking about where she disposed the body, and so she just tried to help investigators by, separating herself from the crime. However, as the episode continues to unfold, we learn that an unrelated male suspect who lived down the street from the Allingers, he becomes the prime suspect, and eventually the forensic evidence would convincingly convict him of being the murderer. We further learn that the mother actually had absolutely nothing to do with the disappearance of her daughter. We learn that she is also a victim in this tragedy. And we also see why those type of lie detector tests, polygraph tests, are considered too unreliable to be admitted as evidence in a court of law. We see example after example of this actually on the forensic files where either the guilty or innocent people give the opposite when it comes to a polygraph test. Likewise, when it came to the psychic, I actually talked to Barbara Corey, the district attorney involved in this case, and she confirmed that the psychic was actually already previously known to the police, that she had worked with the police in regard to other investigations, and that she was never considered an accomplice or a prime suspect. So now, how do we explain this naturally? Just blind, coincidental luck that she was able to draw a map with X marks the spot, leading the investigators to the exact location where the body was in a field that had already been searched with people on their hands and knees? There are plenty of television shows that like to play upon the mysterious, really play it up, and prey upon people's gullibility in an effort to gain an audience and to increase their ratings and sell advertising. The UFO docudramas, the Bigfoot series, the Ghost Hunter series, I think are perfect examples of those types of television shows. But Forensic Files, I mean, this is the opposite. This is the polar opposite of any kinds of those shows. This exists to champion the science. It always champions the science. As a matter of fact, it's quite common at the end of every episode that you'll have either the narrator or an investigator or one of the district attorneys will be looking back, looking at the evidence and how they were able to accumulate it and how forensic science so amazingly was able to take just the slightest shred of evidence and use that to compellingly convict or solve the crime. However, at the end of this episode, they simply were not able to dismiss the unimaginable way in which they were able to discover the body, which truly was the domino that led to finding the killer. They end the episode this way.
If they didn't have forensic science, it would be kind of hard to pinpoint the killers. But it's amazing what they're able to do these days with just the tiniest little things. Piece of grass.
You have to remain scientifically objective and neutral. You can't adopt let's get the bad guys mentality. You can't take sides. In all instances, you have to remain impartial.
About the only thing science couldn't explain was how the psychic knew the location of her body.
The searchers didn't find her, but for the tip from the psychic, it may well have been a long time before she was found.
Listen, I'm going to tell you and confess that I am very skeptical when it comes to dreams, visions, or psychic powers. And I think most of what you hear about are probably shams in that area. And I would caution you to be wary and to be suspicious whenever you're being told stories like that. Okay? I'm not promoting those in any fashion. However, I would think that something such as this, that was fully vetted as a part of a police investigation to again be evidence that perhaps the supernatural might be possible. The fourth line of evidence involves Debbie Thomas. So in January of 2010, my wife, my mom and dad, we all went to California to attend the national championship football game between the Texas Longhorns and the Alabama Crimson Tide. And while we were there, we were walking along the Santa Monica Pier, and this lady came over to my mother and told her how much she admired her Texas Longhorn purse. And we had a really nice, friendly chat, and along the way, she introduced herself as being Debbie Thomas, who happened to be the mother of Earl Thomas Jr., the starting All-American free safety for the Longhorn football team. Well, we went our separate ways. We enjoyed the game. We went back home, and when I got home, I started going through my newspapers to see what sort of articles I had missed. And I found that there was actually an article in the Statesman while we were in California detailing a story about Debbie Thomas and her son, Earl Jr. This article talked about how in 1987 she was pregnant, but then she was diagnosed with cervical cancer. They told her that she might only have 6 months to live, and they recommended that they terminate the pregnancy, that they do a hysterectomy, and they remove her lymph nodes. Debbie replied to the doctors that they just needed to have faith. She was not going to have the surgeries. Her friends and family pleaded with her to reconsider, and her husband, Earl Sr., who had previously lost his mother due to cancer, would eventually stand by her side and support her decision. Now, Debbie continued to get worse, and she would eventually miscarry. However, 2 months later, after feeling much better, she would go back to the doctor, and everyone would be shocked to learn that she was 100% cancer-free. The Statesman reached out to her physician, Homer Stuntz. Homer Stuntz, who subsequently was retired when they reached him, he had been practicing medicine for 52 years. And to validate this story, they asked him about it, and this is what he stated. "You don't forget a Debbie Thomas. No, there are things that you don't ever get to or expect to see as a doctor, and that was one I never thought I'd see. Her biopsy was cancerous from one side all the way to the other, not one piece of healthy tissue. I told her if she didn't have surgery, she was going to die, and I was certain of that. Now, because she chose not to have the hysterectomy, 2 years later she would become pregnant again, and this time she would give birth to Earl Thomas Jr., the starting free safety. Now, Earl would go on to play in the NFL. He would be a Super Bowl player for several years. He would get a chance to play on a Super Bowl winning championship team. Over the course of his career at various teams, there are numerous personal interest stories talking about his life and his career, and you will hear this story repeated in the various hometowns in which he has played in the past. Now, is there a natural explanation for something like this? Well, that's a really good question. Actually, physicians do acknowledge the phenomenon of disappearing cancers. They actually have a term for it. It's called spontaneous regression. The Cancer Therapy Advisor describes it this way: the disappearance of cancer without a satisfactory scientific explanation is rarely encountered by physicians. The process is typically called spontaneous regression or spontaneous remission. In exceptional cases, patients are cured of the disease, in which case the phrase, quote, miraculous healing is sometimes invoked. The Journal of Natural Science, Medicine, and Biology they published a peer-reviewed paper on the topic of spontaneous remissions, and in that paper they noted, the word spontaneous implies without any cause. The standard definition of spontaneous regression is, quote, the partial or complete disappearance of a malignant tumor in the absence of treatment or in the presence of therapy considered inadequate to exert significant influence on the disease, with a further requirement that the original presence of cancer was proven by microscopic examination of tissues. They estimate that spontaneous regression may happen in 1 out of every 80 to 100,000 cases. Now, the general hypothesis at this point, and it is just a hypothesis, is that perhaps the patient acquires a viral infection, and then the body's immune system kicks into overdrive in an effort to rid it of the infection and ends up ridding it of the cancer at the same time. However, part of the problem with this hypothesis is that they know that not all spontaneous regressions can be attributed to a viral infection because not all patients get a viral infection. Furthermore, oftentimes the cancer will return and it ends up going through a cycle of remission and regression. So, can this explain what happened to Debbie Thomas? It's hard to say, really. None of the articles talk about her getting a viral infection, and there are numerous articles detailing this that you can find in various newspapers. And she's been 100% cancer-free since 1987. The cancer has never returned. Now, it's probably impossible to know whether this was a supernatural, transcendent miracle. But Debbie Thomas and her physician clearly thought that it was, and you can read about that on your own if you want to go and search those articles. The fifth and final compelling line of evidence. So this is about Barbara Kaminsky from Chicago, Illinois. So in the 1960s, when she was 14, she was an aspiring gymnast. However, by the age of 15, she began to develop physical issues. She began to have difficulty grasping the gymnast rings. She was becoming a little more clumsy. She found herself tripping easily. She tripped down the stairs a couple of times, and her vision began to blur. Well, they referred her to a neurologist who studied her, but unfortunately, he was not able to determine any sort of a cause or render any sort of a diagnosis. At the time, they simply didn't have the kind of imaging and the sophisticated diagnostic equipment that they would have years later. They initially wondered if perhaps this was multiple sclerosis. Multiple sclerosis, also known as MS, is a degenerative disease that attacks the central nervous system, the brain, and the spinal cord. However, she was considered to be too young to be diagnosed with that. However, just a few years later, by the age of 19, they were able to perform a spinal tap, and confirmed that it was, in fact, multiple sclerosis. Well, throughout the 1970s, her disease would progress, plateau, and then progress further. By the late 70s, her diaphragm became paralyzed. Her vision continued to deteriorate, and she would eventually become legally blind. She had multiple surgeries and 3 times had respiratory and cardiac arrest. She lost control of her urination and bowels and had a catheter permanently installed to catch her secretions. Tumors unrelated to the MS grew on her hands and feet. One lung collapsed and the other functioned at only 50% capacity. Her breathing was so difficult that doctors did a tracheotomy, cutting a hole in Barbara's neck so a respirator could be attached. She was referred to the Mayo Clinic in 1978, but they were unable to offer any further diagnosis, treatments, or hope. By this time, Barbara had become bedridden and her joints and muscles had become contracted and deformed because she was unable to move and exercise them. By 1981, she had been mostly bedridden for 7 years and had not walked at all for the last 2. Her doctors told her parents it was just a matter of time before she would pass, fearing that the next infection would likely take her life. They all agreed no further heroics, surgeries, or hospitalizations would be attempted, and at the age of 31, she was sent home and hospice was called in to help Barbara be as comfortable as possible until her passing. In June of 1981, the local Christian radio station there in Chicago was airing the stories of terminally ill patients and asking their listeners to send in prayers and cards and letters. And so they aired Barbara's story, and they were flooded with prayers, cards, and letters from well-wishers. So on Sunday, June the 7th, 1981, her Aunt Ruthie went by the station, picked up all those cards and letters, and along with 2 other women, went over to Barb's house so they could sit there and read her the prayers and the positive thoughts from the well-wishers. The magazine Christianity Today wrote an article about this story in 1983, 2 years later, and they describe what happened next. Barbara, but not the other 2 women, heard a voice over her shoulder. It was not a booming voice, but a calm one. And it said, "My child, get up and walk." Barbara assumed it was God. She told the 2 women that she was going to walk and that they should go alert her family. Now, since Barbara had not walked in 2 years, the women were confused, but they left the room. Barbara could not wait for her parents. She says she jumped out of bed, and elated, she started down the hall where her mother met her. Barbara's legs, atrophied from the lack of exercise, now had muscle tone and firmness. Her mother's first words were a shout, "Calves! You have calves!" Her father, when Barbara met him downstairs, could summon no words. He grabbed his daughter and danced around the living room with her. And after waltzing with her father, Barbara did ballet steps, standing on her toes, leaping and laughing. An occupational therapist happened to be at the home at the time, and she was just completely stunned and mentioned how this contradicted anything that she had ever read or learned in regard to MS. Now, it was a Sunday, and Barbara's first inclination was that she wanted to go to church. They attended Wheaton Wesleyan Church, and so they were able to get her dressed and rushed over to the church before the start of the Sunday evening service. Her attending physician at the time, Dr. Thomas Marshall, years later would write an account of her recovery, and he describes what happens at the church. As they arrived at the building, Barb bounded up the front stairs ahead of her parents. She waited in the back of the church until Pastor Bailey asked if there were any announcements from the congregation. Barbara then stepped into the center aisle, and as she casually strolled toward the front, she could feel her heart pounding. Pastor Bailey, the first to see her, fell against the pulpit and began to murmur over and over, "This is nice. This is very nice. This is nice." When members of the congregation looked back, a sudden cacophony of whispers came from all parts of the church. "Who is that?" came from the front. "That's Barb," came from the back. "There's Barb. Look, there's Barb Comiskey. I thought she was sick. Look at Barb Comiskey walking down the aisle. She's walking. That's Barb Comiskey." Everyone started clapping. And then, as if led by a divine conductor, the entire congregation began to sing, "Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now I'm found, was blind, but now I see." Tears of joy ran down every face. Pastor Bailey eventually regained his composure and invited Barbara to come to the front to tell her amazing story. There was no sermon, but that was a service no one will ever forget. The local newspaper, the Rock Island Argus, ran a front page story of this event. It was titled, "My Child, Get Up and Walk." It was subtitled, "Near Death, Former MS Victim Heard Voice and Was Cured." Dr. Harold Adolph was also one of her physicians, and he performed several surgeries on Barb while she was afflicted. Years later, after he had retired, he wrote an autobiography detailing his career as a surgeon as well as some of his missionary trips. He wrote this autobiography in 2006, and he spends a couple of pages talking about Barb Comiskey. He notes, "Barbara was one of the most hopelessly ill patients I ever saw. She was diagnosed at the Mayo Clinic as having multiple sclerosis. She had been admitted to the hospital 7 times in the year that I was first asked to see her, and each time she was expected to die. I performed 2 operations on Barbara to help her to be more comfortable, then had to leave for Bangladesh to perform short-term missionary surgery there. In less than 1 week, Barbara was dramatically better. She walked away from her bed in the presence of startled friends. When I returned from Bangladesh, her breathing tube could be removed and the opening in her skin closed because her breathing was normal. The diaphragms were functioning normally. The intestine, which had been vented to the abdominal wall, was reconnected normally. Although some life-threatening complications briefly developed, she was eventually restored to complete health." Dr. Adolph would be the surgeon and the physician who would examine her and fill out the hospital paperwork, releasing her at Central DePage Hospital in Chicago. Again, Dr. Thomas Marshall, her attending physician, continues, noting, "I had known Barb for over 10 years, but just recently assumed her care from a colleague who was moving out of the area. It was hard for me to see her so debilitated. She couldn't leave her room, so I made periodic house calls, but there really was nothing I could do at this point." The next day after her recovery was a Monday, and Barbara called our office for an appointment. My nurse didn't know what to say when she called, but the greatest surprise was when I saw her in the hallway of our office walking toward me. I thought I was seeing an apparition. Here was my patient who was not expected to live another week, totally cured. I stopped all of her medication and took out her bladder catheter, but she wasn't quite ready to have the tracheostomy tube removed until another visit. No one had ever seen anything like this before. That afternoon, we sent Barb for a chest x-ray. Her lungs were now perfectly normal, with a collapsed lung totally expanded with no infiltrate or other abnormality that had existed before. I have never witnessed anything like this before or since, and considered it a rare privilege. Christianity Today concludes their article noting, "MS is an incurable disease. Barbara Comiskey, her doctors admit, should never have gotten well. But not only did MS leave, conclusive spinal taps show no trace, Barbara's caved-in lung, dormant for years, should have been no good. It was completely healthy and functioning. The chronic lung disease, also, quote, incurable, was gone. So were the hand and feet tumors. Even if the woman somehow recovered from MS, there should have been permanent nerve damage. There was none. Fortunately, the surgeon performing Barbara's ileostomy had not removed the entire bowel. Now the bowel was functioning, so the ileostomy was reversed. Likewise, the tracheostomy. Health was entirely restored instantly." Lee Strobel is a former investigative reporter with the Chicago Tribune, and he would research and investigate Barb's story for his book that he published in 2008 titled The Case for Miracles. Lee Strobel would interview Barbara. Barbara is still alive and well today. She is in her 70s, and you can see a copy of Lee's interview with her on YouTube if you want to search and go find it. Lee mentions that this is probably the best documented evidence for a supernatural healing that he has ever found. There are years and years of medical reports. There are x-rays, there are spinal taps, there are hospital reports from the various hospitals that she frequented over the years, confirming her original diagnostic, as well as the testimony of her physicians. As well, there is further ample documentation regarding her complete recovery, including the testimonies of her physicians, again, spinal taps and other hospital reports, chest x-rays, and so forth, including multiple eyewitnesses. So is this a transcendent supernatural miracle? I don't know. I don't know how you could ever prove that. Is there a possible natural explanation for what happened? I can't even imagine a natural explanation, and neither could any of her physicians. I actually went to a couple of skeptic and atheist websites in an effort to see if they had any comments on her story, to see if they had any possible naturalistic explanations, and I couldn't find anything. And as the magazine Christianity Today noted, MS is supposed to be an incurable disease. So the question that we have been exploring today is it rational to believe in miracles? Well, in the opening, I noted that it was my intent to appeal to the atheists and the skeptics. So I'm going to confess that I tend to be pretty skeptical when it comes to these sort of transcendent miracle stories, because most of them are just simply told word of mouth, and they don't have any sort of supporting document. They really lack the sort of evidence that I think that most skeptics and atheists would find very compelling. Furthermore, I think many of those could really be more accurately classified as transformation miracles, whereby you have this series of events that comes together that is an amazing timing, where it appears to some that there's a divine hand involved in the outcome. However, where the believer sees a miracle, many times the atheist or the skeptic will just simply see coincidence. They don't think too much about it. Often a person's worldview will shape the way that they view and interpret the evidence. However, Big Bang Cosmology would appear to confirm that the worldview of naturalism is false. When you look at the mental gymnastics that people have to perform in an effort today to try and get around this supernatural beginning, the Big Bang creation of the universe, their continued faith in naturalism would appear to be the sort of blind faith that atheists and skeptics often condescendingly accuse theists of having. Again, the question is it rational to believe in miracles? Well, to reason is to form conclusions, judgments, or inferences in a rational manner. But from a naturalistic perspective, if we're unable to think, act, and reason freely, then how can we have any confidence in our ability to reason and be rational? Rationality itself would seem to require a supernatural, miraculous existence. The atheist Sam Harris has highlighted this issue in one of his books, noting, when we say that we are reasoning or speaking objectively, we generally mean that we are free of obvious bias, that we're open to counter-arguments, we're cognizant of the relevant facts, and so on. Well, it seems sufficient to notice that in any domain of knowledge, that we are free to say that certain options do not count. In fact, we must say this for knowledge or expertise to count at all. So Harris notes that in order to be able to reason, we must be free of obvious bias. We must be open to the counter-arguments. We must be free to say that certain options do not count. But from a naturalistic perspective, if all of our thoughts and conclusions are determined for us, how can we say that we're free to say that any options do not count? Harris confirms in another book, we can pursue any line of thought we want, but our choice is the product of prior events that we did not bring into being. If you think that you are open-minded and rational then you will have to abandon the worldview of naturalism and embrace the concept of the supernatural. Is it rational to believe in miracles? It would appear that the concept of rationality would require it. Now, that is not to say that we should then abandon prudent observation and investigation and declare every single mysterious event to be caused by the transcendent supernatural hand of God. Okay? Both skeptics and believers look at the transcendent miracle stories in the Bible. And I'm going to say, from my perspective, that transcendent miracles, I think, are an exceptionally rare event. But skeptics and believers will point to the Bible and note the many transcendent miracle stories there, and I will agree that there are many there. But I would also counter, if you take away all of the miracles associated with Jesus and his ministry, that the remaining miracles occur over thousands upon thousands and thousands of years, and they often are sort of clustered together involving seminal events like Jesus and his life and ministry, or perhaps Moses and the Israelites and their exodus from Egypt. Instead, what I have experienced and observed is that God would appear more often, far more often, to work through his sustaining and his transformation miracles. And those cannot be discounted, okay? I think it's important to recognize the validity of those, because if God is truly omniscient and omnipotent, okay, then it should be easier to see how he can use his foreknowledge and then arrange the natural happenings or natural events that he knows are coming, along with the free choices of individuals, to make sure that his will has been accomplished. So just because I believe in the possibility of transcendent miracles, it doesn't mean that I would advise that we should constantly expect transcendent miracles. Okay? If I were Debbie Thomas' husband, I would have strongly encouraged that we seek the very best medical advice, the very best scientific help that we could in ridding ourselves of that cancer. And as a Bible-believing Christian, I would encourage you to do the same. God has stated in the Bible, do not test the Lord your God. We're not supposed to jump off a cliff and expect him to save us. We're not supposed to live our lives thoughtlessly and recklessly and expect him to come behind and sweep up our mess and rescue us every single time. Likewise, I don't think that we're supposed to pray to God and ask for healing and then ignore any and all medical and practical advice, scientific advice, that would actually help that to come about. I do not think that we should expect and assume that God is going to supernaturally intervene anytime that we want something. Listen, I believe in the power of prayer. I believe that the benefits are demonstrable, and that was the point of part one of this presentation, does prayer work? I also believe in transcendent miracles. I think that the evidence is undeniably compelling. But I also believe that God gave us a brain and common sense and rationality for a reason, and he expects us to use those for our own betterment, for the betterment of others, and also to help him to accomplish his will here on earth. So again, thank you very much for your attention. I will remind you once again, before we get into the questions, of the notes. Everything that you have just heard will be in the notes. There is even more in the appendix as far as research and evidence and references and quotes that you would have access to. So I can either send you the hard copy of the notes, or again, if you would like a digital PDF, I'd be happy to send that to you. So at this point, I hope we might have a question or two. So I would be ready if someone would step up to the microphone there.
You mentioned in the case of Cindy Allinger in the forensics files story that you had contacted Barbara Corey, the DA. I wondered if you might elaborate a little more on what you learned when you were investigating that.
Yes. So I didn't want to talk about this story without having a little bit more background than that forensic file episode. So I did a search trying to find a book. Oftentimes on these cases, sometimes they'll have the offer of a book that goes into more detail on there and interviewed. But I could not find any books that were specifically talking about that case. So initially, I tried to call Hector Castro, who was the reporter that was interviewed. He's no longer a reporter. I did find him. He's working for a government agency in Washington. I found his phone number and his email address, and I called numerous times, left several messages, sent him several emails, and he did not return my call, which was frustrating, and so I didn't know what I was going to do. I then decided to reach out to Teresa Berg, who was shown as the lead investigator on that Forensic Files episode, and she was very gracious in calling me back and talking about the episode. And to my shock, I asked her about the psychic and the map, and she initially said, well, I don't know anything about the map. I do know that we got the tip from the psychic, and that was what led to the body, but I don't know anything about a map. And so then I thought, well, that probably sinks this whole case. There's nothing to it. I thought about it a little bit more, and I decided that I would try and reach out to Barbara Corey, who is the district attorney, and she called me back. And I was very thankful that she took the time to call me back. And I mentioned to her that I had talked to Teresa Berg, and I mentioned the psychic, and I mentioned the map. I also mentioned the fact that this story is told in another investigative program. That program, I think, is called, it's also on the Investigative Discovery Program, the ID program. That series is called The Nightmare Next Door, and it was a 1-hour program devoted to this. Now, interestingly, in that program, they didn't say anything about the psychic or the map. Instead, they said that the investigator, quote, on a hunch, went back and researched a field that had been previously searched before. So I asked Barbara Corey about that, about both the Forensic File episode and that ID episode, and she goes, no, they must have taken artistic license with that, because we definitely found the body because of the psychic. And she described to me how those events unfolded in the time period. She said it was clearly the psychic that led them to the body, and the investigator who talked to the psychic was not Teresa Berg. She gave him the name of that investigator. She said that he is off doing private work now, and you can probably find him and contact him and ask him about it. She also gave me the name of the psychic who was identified. Told me that this was a psychic that the police had worked with before. And so I asked her, so do you know if she's been able to help them solve various other crimes before? She didn't know. She didn't know her success or failures in that regard, but she did know that she was a known person to the police and that they had worked with her before. Unfortunately, the investigator, who was the one who talked to the psychic and who went back to the field and discovered the body, I went to go and track him down, and unfortunately I found out that he passed away in 2019, so I was not able to get any further details and talk to him. So in my appendix, I add all of that detail, and that is available there, and so that, I guess, is the rest of the story. So, another question.
Thanks, John. And once again, we appreciate so much you taking the time to present this information, the amount of study that you did to sort of enhance our understanding. So a couple questions. Well, I'll start with the first one, which is a long one, and I know you hate that. So Michael Shermer, I listened to a podcast some time ago where he made, in discussing, he's a skeptic, as you know, in discussing this idea of miracles, made the statement that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. As you know, historically, the Catholic Church as well has been relatively skeptical, at least in the last century, of claims of miracles, and does thorough investigations before making the statement that they feel a miracle or a transcendent miracle has occurred. Now, you didn't cover much in the way of sort of scripture associated with miracles per se, but as you know, when Christ ascended into heaven, he said, I'm going to send you something better, the Holy Spirit. As you know, RTB is frequently a promoter of the idea of concordance, and within that framework describes this idea that humans, because we are fallen, can misinterpret Scripture and have done so in the past. So some theologians do believe that the Holy Spirit now is the way that God works his miracles through acting through the Holy Spirit, and that Holy Spirit is more a guide, a counselor, than rather a transcendent actor on creation. So I guess the question is, do you think that we're doing somewhat of an evangelical disservice as we promote what many are skeptical of, and that is the idea of transcendent miracles?
Do I believe that we're doing a disservice to the gospel and to evangelicals by promoting that transcendent miracles are possible? Is that sort of the bottom line?
Correct, yeah.
Okay.
Do we, within the context of all that verbiage,
Okay.
do you see that when because your implication was that you're skeptical of transcendent miracles.
Yes.
But as you know, Christians, whether it be online or via communications or YouTubes, frequently, constantly promote this transcendent notion, and does that do harm to our evangelical efforts?
Yes. So I don't think that it is a harm to Christianity or to evangelicals by acknowledging the existence of transcendent miracles. I would say that Christianity itself requires that reality, okay? If there were no such thing as transcendent miracles, Christianity would be a false doctrine. It would be a false religion because it hinges on the resurrection of Jesus, which is clearly demonstrated to be a transcendent miracle. Now, I acknowledge that there are a lot of transcendent miracles in the Bible, and I will tell you at this point, I believe every single one of them. However, I do believe that, again, oftentimes you find these clusters of miracles that serve a particular purpose. For example, Jesus and his ministry, the purpose of those miracles, I think, were to validate that Jesus was the Son of God. Okay, so that the people, his disciples who became apostles and the witnesses and the believers would recognize and acknowledge and record for all eternity that Jesus was, in fact, the Son of God. Just look at his life and ministry. Furthermore, I think all of the miracles associated with Moses and the Exodus, I think, served a purpose. They wanted the Israelites to see that he was their God and that he had power, that they could have faith in him. And that other miracles, I think, God has done for certain purposes. Now, where I do think we do a disservice is when we're constantly referring to sustaining or transformational type miracles and acting like they're supernatural, transcendent miracles. Because then a lot of times those can be, again, shown to be through natural acts, which the atheist or the skeptic thinks that, naturalism is what there is. That's their God, so to speak. The laws of nature is their God, and it can explain everything. But as a theist, we have just demonstrated through Big Bang Cosmology that no, they haven't existed the whole time. They came into existence. Something else outside of them has to explain their existence. And now we're learning that the laws of nature are so fine-tuned and so meticulous for our existence. We're also having to explain how they came to be in such a way. And so I think the worldview of the atheist and the skeptic is really in danger there. But again, where I do think that we do a disservice, and I think that you as a physician, LD, have mentioned this before, I don't think that we should ever discount these sustaining or transformation miracles, and that when we pray to God, that we don't necessarily have to expect or believe that a transcendent supernatural healing is going to occur, but that healings do occur and can be the product of God and his foreknowledge, okay, in the sustaining and transformation miracles in the surgery room or whatever the case may be. So again, as a theist, I think that we should, as much as anything, believe that sustaining miracles and transformation miracles can be the hand of God. But again, I just think it does us a disservice when we call an event a supernatural event and then all of a sudden we find some sort of a naturalistic explanation. We're acting like it was a supernatural event, but there's a natural cause for it. Then why believe any of the other things that we think are supernatural? So I hope I covered that question.
Yes, thank you.
Adequately. Thank you.
I have another question.
Okay.
So Sam Harris seems to have evolved a little bit with regards to his perspective, likely in part because of, as you point out, the difficulty that a reductionist mentality faces with regards to free will, and seems to embrace recently this idea of panpsychism, specifically that matter itself has experience and consciousness. Now, some of the philosophy of panpsychism is above my pay grade, but my suspicion again is that he's trying to deal with this paradox that he's created in his way of thinking. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so do you know where he has published his thoughts on panpsychism?
It is, I've heard him on blogs, I'm sorry, on podcasts discussing it.
Okay. So I'm not familiar with his thoughts. I haven't read about that. I thought that I had read his latest book, which talks about spirituality without religion, which was an interesting book. And he is obviously wrestling with his determinism. And what's interesting is that he, especially in his book on free will, there was the ending of one chapter was just phenomenal, and I thought that perhaps one of his editors or someone would have pointed out to him, trying to remind him what it is that he believes and what he's promoting. But at the end of this chapter, I mean, he keeps talking and describing our ability and our nature as if we have the freedom to do these things. And he's using that language, and he's talking about how we should recognize this, and then we should do X, right? How do we have the freedom to recognize it and then do X? We're going to be determined to do what it is we're determined to do. And so he made several statements in a row which seemed to completely contradict his belief. But then, in parentheses, at the very end, he inserted this comment about how, well, ultimately, we're being steered. He was talking about how we could steer our own path, how we could grab our own life and do these things. And then in parentheses, he said, while recognizing ultimately we're being steered. So when you embrace naturalism and you acknowledge that you don't have the ability to think, act, or reason freely, but then you go about and make arguments as if you believe and know the truth, and you expect other people to be able to freely recognize that and then change their lives. I mean, the whole thing is contradictory in my mind. It undermines itself, if I put it to you that way. It's like making the statement that I just found a proof that shows that there are no proofs. Okay, it completely wipes out what you're saying. It undermines itself. And so that's why I say that it's hard to take their arguments and their beliefs and their opinions seriously, because at the end of the day, they all have to admit that they arrive at that opinion because of a physically determined state of their brain. And it may or may not be true. And there's no way for them to know whether or not it's true, because whatever they decide at that next level, they were also physically determined to think and believe. So to answer your question, I have not read how he's gotten off onto panpsychism, so it's hard for me to comment on that, but I would like to read that, actually.
I'll send you a little link.
Yeah, that'd be great. Thank you.
This is a question from online. It's asking if you'd like to elaborate on the idea of the relationship between faith and miracles. As Jesus said, you can have faith the size of a mustard seed and move mountains.
Yes. So that is a really good and deep philosophical and theological question. And I did not research a really good answer to that question. I can tell you that is a verse that I don't think that we are meant to take literally, because I don't see that unfolding, but I think is meant to convey a different truth. Now, what that truth is, obviously, faith can do tremendous things. And I believe that there is scientific evidence that faith does tremendous things. Faith has a tremendous amount of help in health and healing. In the first part of this series, dealing with does prayer work, one of the things that the medical reports are constantly referring to is that in all of these studies, they have to set up a placebo group, because they know if they don't, that people who think that they're going to get well or have faith can sometimes amazingly do so. And so they have to set up these placebo groups to try and judge whether a medicine is effectively working. So we know that our faiths and our beliefs have power over our bodies. Now, again, I don't believe that we can literally move mountains if we have the faith that we can move mountains. That may not be the official evangelical perspective. I think that most thoughtful Christians would also embrace that. I do think that our faith is extremely important, but I also think that the object of our faith is extremely important. And in the Bible, they make a mockery of other people's faith in things that aren't worth believing. They make a mockery of other people who have gods that are only made of stone and aren't real. You have the episode on Mount Baal, I think it was, when they had the prophets were having the competition between the God of the Israelites and the God of Baal, and they were mocking the faith of those prophets. And any time in the Bible where it argues on and it speaks positively of faith and it promotes the subject of faith, it is always specifically referring to the faith in God, okay, or the faith in Jesus, the faith in the Bible. Whenever it refers to the faith of false prophets or the faith of false religions or false gods, it is always condescending. So the object of the faith is always important. And so again, that's why I think we as believers, we should question our faith. And I think in doing so, as we research the evidence for our faith, I think that will make you a stronger Christian. I can say personally, there have been times when I've had a crisis of faith. I've then gone back over the things that I know and have researched and found to be true, and that often provides a really strong foundation for my faith. My faith is not a blind faith. My faith is due to a lot of research and evidence and again, thoughtful consideration and a desire to know the truth. And I've said this to my family, to my wife and my daughter, and anyone who will listen, at the end of the day, I just want to know the truth. And if there's ever a point that the Christian faith, I believe, is not truthful, then I'm out of here. But at this point, my faith continues to strengthen with what I've learned. Any other questions?
Got a couple of online here. So, is it okay to pray for a miracle, or best to pray for Lord's will, whatever the outcome? In other words, should we be redirecting how Christians pray and not depend on a miracle and what they want to get out of the miracle?
In all instances, I ultimately think we should always pray for God's will first and foremost as a primary concern. So whatever it is that we want to happen, first, before we ask for that, we should pray for God's will and acknowledge that God sees the big picture, right? We don't see the big picture. We only see a small part of the overall big picture. And so sometimes the things that we're praying for, that may not actually help accomplish the overall big picture, the final goal that God has in mind. Sometimes we look back. I can tell you from my own experience that there was a time when I was between two jobs. And I was praying for God to tell me which of these two jobs He wanted. Now, I was very clear I wanted this job over here. This was the job I was comfortable with. This is the job that I knew about. This is the job that I really, really wanted. It came with a company car and a salary and all these other sort of benefits. This is clearly what I wanted. But, God, I want your will to be done. You know, if you want me to take this other job, then this is the job that I'll take. In the end, I ended up taking this other job. This other job led me to Austin. It led me to my wife, Lacey. It led me to our wonderful daughter, Ashton. It led me to some fantastic friends. It led me to a career and a ministry that I could have never even dreamed of. God's will for my life was different than the will that I had, and I'm thankful that His will played out and that mine didn't. So ultimately, I would say we want to pray for God's will, but also recognize that sometimes, and we see this in the Bible, okay, we're meant to suffer. We're meant to suffer for a reason, and that God can use our suffering to, again, help accomplish the things that He wants to happen. You know, a lot of Christians, if everything was perfect for Christians and we were always happy and we were proclaiming our faith in God, that's not nearly as compelling as people who are suffering and in pain and then still can acknowledge to God the blessings that they have in their life and be that true beacon, be that true witness. There are so many people that come to Jesus because they see a Christian and how their faith helps them to get through and handle an episode, and they see the peace in their life and the hope in their life, and they decide that, you know what, I think I want a piece of that in my life. Yes, next question.
Another question from online. You mentioned you contrasted naturalism and free will, but isn't there a third option? Could free will be an emergent property of natural processes?
Yes, so in such a small little snippet, the subject of free will is one that has been debated for centuries. You have volumes and volumes of book that are devoted to the subject, and you can't possibly cover every single thing. But the emergence of free will is also a supernatural phenomenon. So anyone who believes in the emergence of free will is then embracing a supernatural phenomenon. So what they are essentially saying is that somehow the natural processes of life will grow and get to a certain point of complexity to the point that it can then come back, and that's called a bottom-up causal chain. A bottom-up causal chain is the laws of nature are causing things to happen, and they sort of well up from the cause of nature. Anyone who believes in free will believes in a top-down causal chain. They believe that we can cause things, and so that comes from the top down, from our freedom, that the laws of nature aren't causing us to do things. Well, emergence believes that the causal nature rises to a point of complexity to where this freedom can then emerge out of this and then start causing this top-down causation. And we then have this free will that emerges out of this natural process. Now, for us to have that sort of freedom, if it's a true freedom, then what that means is that the laws of nature are no longer causing us to think certain things and to do certain things and to believe certain things. No, our freedom has emerged. It's a very difficult thing to prove. At this time, it is a concept. It, again, counters the idea of naturalism. Okay, so people who believe in naturalism, they are forced to deny that because it admits that naturalism can no longer explain everything. And outside of the hypothesis of our free will being an explanation for that, there is no other example of that. It is truly to imagine, truly difficult to imagine how you can take matter that is mindless and meaningless and thoughtless and in some way rearrange it in a form of complexity where then all of a sudden these capacities, these traits emerge that simply did not exist at all whatsoever before, that now all of a sudden we're mindful, we're thinking, we have freedom that we didn't have before. So that is a hypothesis. It is a minor position, but I do appreciate the person asking about it so I could elaborate on it. Any other questions at this point? Okay, well, thank you very much to our viewers. Thank you for coming here and watching in person. And again, remember, next month, Dr. John Franklin Lane in April, it will be a story that I guarantee you will never forget. Thank you very much.